Well, as more and more sincere Christians are beginning to question, and they're beginning to hear and learn things that are, well, they're not really hearing in the church. For example, I've heard people say, what? Jesus? He wasn't born on December 25th? Who and what was born on December 25th? If it wasn't him, what are the origins of Christmas? They're pagan? How could that be? And where did Saint Nick and Santa Claus come from? Are they twin brothers, just brothers or Siamese twins? Where did they come from? How did they get into Christmas and the birth of our Messiah? Who were they in the past? And what, Easter? That too? Pagan? And wow, I can't find that actually in the Bible. The word Easter, or even the Greek word for Easter, just isn't in the New Testament. Oh yeah, and bunnies. They don't lay eggs. Should have had that figured out when I was a kid, but you know, we all believe what we're taught when we're growing up and what we practice, and there's a lot of truth that we learn, but there's also things that we learn that is not truth. And as we begin reading in the Word, we see how he feels about some of these things that we've been doing and we've been practicing all along. For example, in Deuteronomy, at the very end of Deuteronomy chapter 12, last 3 verses or so, you can read it for yourself. And he basically says, do not worship me the way the nations worship their gods. I don't want any pagan practices copied to worship me as the creator of this universe. The Most High does not want to be worshipped in those ways. And then we go to the New Testament. Yeah, even there in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, in verses 18 to 14, we can see what fellowship, what intermingling does our Messiah have with Belial? And darkness, what kind of fellowship and intermingling should we mix darkness with light? Symbolically speaking, of course. Or the temple with idolatry, with idols. Well, there shouldn't be any intermingling is the point. He says if you don't even touch these things, don't let him make a part of your practice, he will be your maker and your one and only Savior. The Most High, as we understand, through his Son, of course, as a mediator and as in providing a special helper in ways that we all need. And there's many other scriptures that talk about not intermingling these things. And so what is the natural reaction as we start finding out about these pagan feasts? Well, then next, another common response and a step going forward is to see that, wow, there's biblical feast days. What are they? And they're for all humanity, not just the Jews. They're not just for the Jewish people, they're for everybody, and it's an actual chronological order, a plan of salvation for all humanity. Yes, that, and then many Christians more and more are starting to keep the biblical feast days. Now, what must the adversaries do to stop this? Or at least to minimize as much as possible, if they can't stop it, to minimize. What would an adversary, a chief adversary and his allies, what would they do against this end-time growing movement of awakening that's happening today? Well, cause confusion, right? Cause confusion leads to divisions and upsets, and we see a lot of this happening as people come to understand the feast days. Because, well, one way to cause confusion is to bombard with counterfeit calendars. Now, a counterfeit, what is a counterfeit? Well, a counterfeit dollar bill, it looks the same. In fact, if you use the five senses, it looks the same as sight, it feels the same, it smells the same. With whatever five senses you're using, it's hard to tell the difference between the two. And many times people say, well, how do I know what is the true and what is not a counterfeit? Well, I've heard government agents will say, well, you got to get to know the real thing. The more you get to know the real thing, the more you can understand and decipher which ones are not. And this is what we need to do as we start studying the calendar issue, because there's a number of counterfeit calendar systems and calendars out there that are more than 2,000 years old, that go back into the BCE time period. And they also can cleverly be interpreted logically from the Hebrew language of the biblical Hebrew, Tanakh, or as many people refer to today still as the Old Testament. So those who have ears to hear, I believe, will hear. And when the correct information is brought to their table, it's presented to them with enough love. As we say in the Greek, agape is like this love that our Creator has with humans. And then that transcends into humans loving each other as He loves us. So it's kind of like brotherly love and this godly love, this love that our Maker has with humanity. And so as we can have patience with one another, and as He has so much patience for us, sometimes it's overwhelming how much patience He has. And He hasn't given up on Israel, as messed up as Israel has been in the centuries, and the church as messed up as it's been. He's not given up, thankfully. And He's given us more time to educate, to learn, to seek first that kingdom and His righteousness. And so, such is what we're going to dive into with this topic today. I'm going to present this topic today because some believers out there, they just cannot see a 13th month in the Scriptures. They adopt an ancient calendar system to divide the year into 12 months only. And if you're wanting to keep the biblical feasts, this is what's stimulating a research and a study and an open-mindedness after being misinformed in their past, in the background. It's hard to trust again, obviously, whether it be scholarship or other people out there. And each one of us needs to formulate our beliefs. And there's a number of these calendar systems that do not ever add a 13th month, and they go back into the BCE times, as I said. In each of these, what I call anti-13th month calendar systems, they do not utilize the cycles of the moon to begin. So what I'm talking about is beginning of each month is based upon the cycle of the moon. These calendar systems that never have a 13th month do not do that. And each one of them can, like I said, match the interpretations from the Hebrew Tanakh. But what? So how can they be different? How can they be different even from each other? Because there's more than one out there, as some of you probably already found out. And you might ask, well, how can they be different? Why? If they're all, how can they all be interpreted from the Hebrew language of the biblical Hebrew of the Tanakh? How is that? How is there so many? How could that be if they're interpreting it from the Scriptures and making it very logical? Well, to answer that question, we're going to dive right into my slide here. I'm going to switch over my camera to my presentation of the slide. As I title Ezekiel's Biblical 13th Month. In subtitle, I'll say verses, Never a Biblical 13th Month. I put a question mark there because Some will say never is there a 13th month in the Bible. Therefore, they don't want to believe in it. And because some, like I said, cannot see it in the Bible. So they adopt a calendar that divides each year into equal months only. Never a 13th month during any year. Never an intercalated 13th month. For example, the zodiac calendar. And what I've noticed is they will prioritize the stars above the moon when it comes for Moedim, determining the beginning of each month based upon dividing into a solar year, dividing by 12, and that's what the Babylonian zodiac is about. Don't want to get too much into description and definition of them. And that calendar worked for other purposes. Even the Babylonians, I'll just say, they did not utilize the zodiac to begin their months. Since 499 BCE, it's an archaeological fact. I have all the facts if anyone wants it. They began their months with the visible crescent of the moon, the waxing moon when it first reappears after going into its dark phase each month, the visible crescent moon. But the zodiac calendar was used for other purposes, as I said. There's the Enoch, also known as the Jubilee calendar, found in these old ancient books, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They still use the full moon for cycles in some ways. Don't want to explain all the complicated issues of that, but not compliant with the Second Temple Sanhedrin. The lighter-skinned Jewish history, as I'll say, the history is good from the Second Temple Sanhedrin, including Josephus and Philo. The Second Temple and the New Testament major events, all the feast days that are listed in there are the major events in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, everything from the Passover onward with the feast days, and in the Tanakh, the Babylonian calendar month names, as we see 7 of them. I'll get to that a little bit later. The Jubilee calendar is not compliant with any of these credible sources of over, I'd say, compiling of the last 2,500 years altogether. So higher priorities in the moon. Let me just revisit this, even though I covered it in more detail last video teaching from last week. He appointed the moon, this is our creator, he appointed the moon, the Yarach, some say Yareach, the Yud, the Resh, and the Het. He created that moon for seasons. The Hebrew word is Moedim. Same Hebrew word as in Genesis 1:14. He created the 2 great lights and so forth, and I covered that more in the other teaching. But this word Yoreach versus Chodesh, and that's the word that's used for new moon. And so they're completely 2 different Hebrew words, but as I pointed out in the previous teaching, is that they're interchangeable. As we see in 1 Kings, I believe it's chapter 8. And I brought that out in last week's teaching. I addressed all those, and the title of that one is Moon versus quote unquote new moon. If you want to Google search that or search that on YouTube, or you'll find it on my ministry websites. Now verse 19, I think it's important to state that it does not state all Moedim, as the lunar Sabbath believers conclude. So there's this lunar Sabbath calendar where they say all Moedim, including the weekly Moedim, that's the weekly Sabbaths, must be based upon the moon. And I don't want anyone out there to think that I take that conclusion, because the word all is not in there. And the Jubilee and the Enoch calendar say, oh, right, now you're talking, Russell. That's right. So they will use the full moon on certain years for Moedim, and it has to happen on a Wednesday of the Passover. And again, I don't want to get into all the detail of that. So to help filter all this stuff out, in the least, moon phases or cycles are necessary for feasts. Specifically, in the months, the first month, we have the Passover season, as we call it. It's a completing of 8 days, counting the Passover and the 7 days of unleavened bread. There's the 7th month, where the fall feasts are. And then the 3rd month does have another moed, an annual one, but that's based on counting 50. It's not based upon the moon, where the 1st and the 7th months, the moon is critical in getting the accuracy on what date, numbering the date. Okay, if it's going to be on the 14th day, the 15th day, you count 8 days from there or 7 days from there. You have to know when that month starts to count those days accurately to the correct dates. And again, the Second Temple Jewish history plus the New Testament is necessary to weed out these counterfeits. I'm going to touch on this later. Of course, this topic is going to be focusing on Ezekiel, but I'm kind of laying some groundwork here as I get to Ezekiel. Why is the 13th month not easy to find in the Bible? That is a great question. That's a question a lot of people ask, which draws them and leads them to the Enoch calendar or zodiac calendar. Before I continue, I see 3 comments coming in. Let me just review to see if I should address them before going onward. Someone asks, is today the Sabbath? Yes, today is the weekly Sabbath that I'm recording now as I speak live. Okay, so I'll continue on. Some good little comments about, okay, my recording is, yes, it is going on here. I'm recording as I speak. Okay, back to the slide. And people who reject the 13th month, of course, they're going to ask this question, and when people can't find it, they come up with some good arguments. And I'm going to address those arguments in this video teaching. That's why it's a little bit longer. You'd think it'd be a short, quick video on Ezekiel 13th month, but I'm going to address the good arguments that come against it. But to answer this question, why is it not easy to find in the Bible? Well, always try to remember Proverbs 25:2. It says, it is the glory of Elohim. That's the Hebrew name there, the Hebrew word for God. It is the glory of Elohim to conceal a matter. In other words, he likes to hide truth, just like children like to play hide and seek, and even adults like to play these treasure hunts in the cities. They do it at the tech companies for off-site team bonding. It's fun to hunt for things, and when things are too easy, we take them for granted. But when it's made hard to find and we find it, we appreciate it so much more. And our Creator's had this figured it out. And He's smarter than we are, of course. So he's figured this out a long time ago. So he likes to hide truth, but it is the glory of kings to search out these matters. In other words, to seek first, to be like treasure hunters. You know, when you're hunting for treasure, you got to go through a lot of dirt. If you're a gold miner or panning for gold, you have to go through a lot of dirt, a lot of stuff to get to the gold, to get to the treasure. It usually takes a lot of work, but it's findable. It is there if we can have enough faith and keep searching and being willing to have thick skin, if I may use that idiom, and keep on searching and seeking. But our Creator intentionally is withholding information, or He's dispersing it or scattering it through the Scriptures like a jigsaw puzzle that's scrambled. It's hard to put it together, but if you put the wrong pieces together, you're not going to see the picture the way He's designed this jigsaw puzzle to fit together. Or He's burying explicit information on purpose, making the truth hard to find so that people have to seek. They have to be treasure hunters, truth seekers. For example, parables, metaphors, allegories. There's a lot of this in the Scriptures just to make it difficult. But it's findable. It's not a mission impossible to understand the mysteries. We have to seek it. We have to put it as a higher priority in our life. And so let's remember, this 13th month is not as easy to find as a lot of people would like. And there's times when I wish it was a lot easier for other people as well to see it. But notice this here in Isaiah 28:13. He says, but the word of, here's that holy name, that Yud-He Vav-He, Yahuwah, Yahweh. There's different ways to pronounce that with the vowels. There was no vowels back then, and there's no need to debate or cause division over it. But anyway, Yahweh, Yahuwah. I like to say Yah a lot of times to be neutral and non-offensive. It's not even offensive to Judaism to say Yah, because we all sing Hallelujah, and it's considered also a title or a short part of the holy name, the first part of it. Anyway, it says precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little, that they might go and fall backwards. Now, you can go back and read the context, and to put it in a nutshell, people with the wrong hearts or stiff necks, they're stubborn. If there's a prejudice that people have against skin colors or racial prejudice or religious prejudice, Jews against Christians or Christians against Jews, and this baggage carries over into the faith, well, it's going to affect people's conclusions. And so we have to get rid of the stiff necks and prejudice, because he is doing this, and sometimes the intent is that for people with the wrong hearts that are not really obedient, they're not going to get it. And so that's why he makes it a little difficult, so that they will be broken and snared and caught. There's 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 where it talks about if they do not love the truth, it says that even our Maker sends a strong delusion to those who do not love the truth. And I say enough. We all can love the truth, but we got to love it enough. We got to prioritize it and seek it without stiff necks, without prejudice, without our hearts being in the wrong place. Because this is our calling, as 1 Peter 2:9 says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. So we're called to be priests someday. A holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Amen. Okay, I see some more comments come in. Let me take a break to check them out. Okay, I'll continue on here. This Hebrew techufah is also an important word to understand correctly. However, I'm not going to address that to know more exactly. This is what helps us to know when the Torah biblical year should intercalate a 13th month. And I'm saving that for more, because that's a more difficult to clarify topic, for another separate video teaching in the future. There's no 13th month this year to worry about, so it's kind of on the back burner. Eventually I'll get to that. But I do have a lot of literature that I could provide for anyone upon a request. And if you're interested in the video, of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. Okay, is there any explicit proof for only 12 months? That's a question that I want to address before getting to Ezekiel, because some out there who say, yes, they go to 1 Kings 4:7 where it says, and Solomon had 12 governors over all Israel, who provided food for the king and his household. Each one made provision for 1 month of the year. Now, Solomon had a big household. I mean, how many wives and concubines did he have? That's, just in those women, it's 1,000, not to mention whatever men and servants and so forth. So he had 12 governors, and one, he had to have them actual full governors, because there's a lot of people to deal with, and I think a lot of us realize. But what I propose is many general statements in the Bible are made with general statements, not to take things too hyper literally. For example, Israel's rejection, not all Israelites, not all Jews are bad or rejected the covenant. And also being restored, you go to Romans 11:25 and through 27 and 28 says all Israel will be saved. All Israel. Does that mean that every single Jewish person will be saved? How do we define Israel? And so there's ways to understand things that are not just on the surface level of the text by itself, and we have to be careful about hyper-literal interpretation. So it says each one made provision for 1 month. You could say 1 month of the year. So some will say, well, why not mention a 13th governor for unusual 13th months? That is a great question, and that's why I want to address this before going forward into this topic with Ezekiel. Perhaps a better question is, where does it say that governors must never exercise rotation or to a different, say, previous month compared to the previous year, whenever there is to be a 13th month? In other words, where is the command for Governor 1, as an example, to always remain serving the first month every year continually? Well, it's not in the Torah. This is something Solomon came up with as a decision to deal with all these people and food for himself and all those around him. Again, nothing in the Torah or the Tanakh to command that governors must serve and remain in the same month every year. So why should we assume that they did and use a lot of dogma and determine a calendar based upon something that's more ambiguous and not as explicit as we would like, or as I would like? Another comment here. Pat says here, in other words, where is the instruction to index Governor 1 to Governor month? Interesting. Yeah, that is an interesting point. It doesn't say Governor 1 has to stay with Governor first month every year or in any type of wording. Great point, Pat. Thank you for your comment. Moving forward, let's look at some logistics to a 13th month governor rotations. Let's say that Solomon said, okay, we're going to assign a 13th governor for that whenever that 13th month happens. Well, what I propose is the wisdom of Solomon here, knowing he was wiser than any man at the time, and perhaps since, other than our Messiah. But a 13th governor would be very inexperienced and not be nearly as efficient. There would be more mistakes because he's not doing it every year. By doing such only once every few years, like say every third or fourth year, when you're doing things more regularly and doing things annually, you're more refreshed and you're reminded and you're better at what you're doing. That's why we keep these feasts every year. We don't skip a year or two or three. If we did, we would have a lot of forgetfulness. Perhaps more difficult than going and doing annual U.S. federal and state tax filing. Any of you have to do that? It's like, oh man, I got to do that again, and you got to get refreshed even just by being a year from doing that. If you procrastinate on that, well, if you only did your tax filing every third or fourth year, think about how much more difficult it would be to remember how you did it last time. And even though you can ask others and get advice, it's a lot better when you're doing things more frequently. And of course, this is just thinking logically. Think about each governor. They could have opportunity to serve during a feast month eventually. So there would be no arguments or politics to get the best or the easiest months every year. Someone may not want the feast months to serve the king and to be in charge of the food and for all these people. They may not want to do it on a feast year, like the first month or the 7th month or for Shavuot. And others might want it that month. And so here, if you're a governor, you kind of rotate as there's a 13th month. What do I mean by that? Well, again, Solomon was wiser and he improvised than a lot of people would. With abundant counsel he used. He says with abundant counsel there's safety. as he wrote in the Proverbs. And there's priestly decisions, including issues not addressed in the written Torah well enough. And this is what he's doing. He's starting something that's not addressed in the Torah. Often, he's wiser than what I propose than most modern Christians who are coming into Torah. They realize he was making these decisions and making the wisest decisions he could as he was going, improvising and not trying to add to the Torah and make this a commandment that this is equal or higher than the actual writings of Moses. But unfortunately, there is still too much the way I word it is Christian baggage in the Hebrew roots, with too many still having this axe to grind against the lighter-skinned Jewish people, especially unconsciously. I used to have some myself, more than I do now, and if someone were to say, "Hey, Russ, that sounds a little anti-Semitic," or you have some kind of axe to grind against the Jews because you're saying that's Jewish, or I don't want to follow that calendar because this is what the history shows and that's too Jewish. Well, there's also this attitude out there that we're better than the Jews because we got the Holy Spirit, we've got the covenant, the new covenant, and this kind of transcends, I see, into people's attitudes in their hearts when they don't like to accept 2,000 years of credible Jewish history, how they've recorded how the Second Temple did things, and with this, in this case of Solomon, there's not enough history how he did this. So I'm just proposing some logical ways that he would do it with a 13th month. So we must overcome also not just any kind of prejudice or thinking we're just so much greater than the Jewish people, but there's this phobia of a 13th month, and that could have some background to it. The technical term is Triskaidekaphobia, however you pronounce that. That's a pretty highfalutin word there, right? There's a lot of us out there, but simply a phobia of this. It's basically this fear of a 13th month, that it's unlucky number. There's the Friday the 13th fears that are out there, and so forth. And so maybe some of this is transcending and progressing into people's view of just hating there to be a 13th month every once in a while. Okay, we got a couple more comments coming in here. Patrick says, we don't want to be too hard on ourselves as we, his called and chosen ones, choose our apple of his eye and more valuable than birds. And then another comment is here, I think we are all equal because we are all Israel. All 12 tribes are important. Amen. Not one is important than the other. Yeah, this is where we need to progress to come to unity and oneness, is to overcome these things. But as I share this with people, I could see this attitude that whatever Jewish history says, whether it be Philo, Josephus, they'll either want to point to them as being Hellenized or put down. But look at this, there's some 13s here. Let me progress here. There's only 12 tribes of Israel starting out, but then Joseph causes a 13th with Ephraim and Manasseh. And the double portion of blessings. And there's only 12 Talmudim, or disciples, as we say in English. And then Judas caused the 13th apostle, because, of course, we know about him betraying. And there's only 12 Talmudim, like I said originally. These are the disciples plus Messiah. That makes a 13, the number 13. And then there's the Last Supper, as some people refer to it as, the Passover. There was only 13 people there that we can see in the Scriptures. One of those Talmudim turned out to be bad, of course, but it wasn't number 13. There's 12 of them. Yeshua would make number 13, but he was one of those 12. So the reason there's also a discrepancy between Passover and Last Supper, why was there no women and children there? Passover was a family feast. You always have women and children there. And so the two ideas from that would be, not to get off on too much of a tangent, would be that they just simply weren't listed there. But what I propose is basic Judaism 101, is that the night before the actual Passover meal, the graduating senior rabbis would have a pre-Passover meal for the graduating young rabbis who were going to lead their first Passover the following night. They would do a practice run the night before for training and get everything in their memory, because they're going to be doing it the next night in a special way. So I've heard even modern rabbis even tell me that, and there's enough evidence in history. So this is why when we read the New Testament, it seems like, what? Why is he doing the Passover the night before that all the Jews are doing the Passover the next day? Was it just a calendar discrepancy, or was it simply that he was training them at the beginning of the 14th before he had to die during the actual time that the lambs were dying? Now that becomes a very debatable topic, and I don't want to get into that with this video teaching, but the point I'm making is that the Last Supper only had 13 people, or if we want to call it a Passover meal, a practice Passover run through. Now the book of Revelation expresses this restoration back to 12 tribes, the creation back to the garden settings, and also we see a new heavens and a new earth. And what I speculate and see is that this could be including a calendar astronomy, that the timing could be restored to, when you go back to the flood, you see with Noah after the flood, there's 150 days in the ark, and the ark rests after 150 days, and it calls it 5 months. And so there's equal 30-day months for 5 months. And sometimes in scriptures with prophecy, you see that there's these equal 30-day months continually. Well, prior to the flood, there could have been some things happening that the flood caused all this water shift of this water canopy over the atmosphere, the water under the ground coming out to create this huge flood could have affected the gravitational pull of the moon and its orbit, and causing the solar year to go from 360 days exactly to 365 and a quarter. And the moon does this elliptical cycle orbit around the Earth. Well, of course, flat earthers are not going to like my view on that. So you'll have to forgive me, and I won't have much credibility for them out there on this point that I'm making. But you know, I had a little debate with a believer in the Jubilee calendar, and we talked about that, the 5 months, the 150 days, and I've had, you know, debates with others who believed in the Enoch calendar on this issue. But the point being is that 13 isn't such a bad number after all, and that when there's a restoration back to 12, 13 can be a sign of the cause of disobedience, the cause of rebellion or betrayal of the covenant of the Creator in any big serious way. That 13 that's why 13 becomes this negative number in a lot of people's minds, but it can also have an optimistic view when we see the tribes and the disciples and then there being a 13th apostle, but really becoming the 12th. So this 12 and 13 are kind of interchangeable in some ways. But in the meantime, you know, we are stuck in these changes to Yah's planning. And people say, well, Yah doesn't change. He never changes anything. Well, yeah, he doesn't change. Malachi 3:6. And Hebrews 13:8 says that Yeshua is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But do they never change anything? Some people take this really extreme view that they don't change anything. Well, look at the fall in the garden, the change in the creation, in the soil. and the plants and the animals, the carnivores, going from vegans to carnivores, the change in the female body and the difficulty in giving birth and so forth. He does change things, not himself. And also the fall, I call it the post-garden fall. That's what I also call the flood, that has most likely caused some change in the astronomy. It's not explicit, but doing midrash through the scriptures, that's kind of what I lean toward. And thirdly, look at the fall of the Levitical priesthood. We see a change in the priesthood going back to Melchizedek. And that's in Hebrews chapter 7, the tithing, even the Levites paid tithes till Melchizedek. And it says there's a change in the law. And the Christians say, oh, see that? The law changed. But in context, the only two topics in Hebrews 7 is the priesthood changing, and then there's this mention of tithing. It's not talking about the Ten Commandments or anything else changing in that chapter, or in any other topics in that chapter other than those two. So we do see some changes, that he changes some things, not himself, but for righteousness' sake. He'll change things for his name's sake, for a better plan. If plan A doesn't work out so well, he'll have a better plan B to help straighten things out and then bring restoration. So for more info, just a little more before diving into Ezekiel, thank you for your patience out there if you're hanging in there with it. Many, but not all books and chapters of the Holy Bible, our scriptures, were written in a general chronological order, as typical true journals or storytelling, that there's a chronological order to the book. Not all the books, but there are many books. And can you think of any examples? I'll give a couple examples if you want to throw in an example in the comments, but they should be obvious and simple and not hard to figure out. For example, Genesis, right? You're reading Genesis, you're going through the stories. It doesn't start talking about Jacob before Abraham. It doesn't start talking about Abraham before Noah. There's Exodus, coming out. We don't see them starting with the Passover. There was 9 plagues before that, and it seems like there's this chronological order to the 10 plagues, and progressing through, coming out, and the crossing of the Red Sea, and so forth. The 4 Gospels going off this general chronological order, either starting with his birth and his parents, or just simply going into his ministry and going forward. And like I said, generally, and even in the book of Acts, you don't see Paul converted on the road to Damascus before chapter 2 of the day of Pentecost, as we say in Greek, counting 50, Shavuot, as we say in Hebrew. So there's this general chronological order to a lot of the books. Of course, not the book of Revelation. When it comes to a lot of prophecy and there's backtracking, some books are very hard to understand. If we take this chronological approach always, we're going to get messed up and confused and come to some wrong conclusions. So I don't want to propose that all these books and that every book in every single way is chronological in its order, but it is pretty simple. It should be. And yes, on Ezekiel chapters 1 through 8, if you read through it, I'm not going to read through all these chapters and spend all that time reading through it, but it's simply a chronological diary, if I may say. Oh, some people say, oh, diary, that's a feminine word. Okay, journal. That's more of a masculine word. It's a chronological journal of his visions and the happenings that are going on during this king's reign, that are not every day listed, I would say. I'm not saying it's a day by day and listing every single day that's happening with him. So it could be at least, as we'll look at the math here as we dive into it, at least 437 days. I put plus in there and you'll see why as we progress. Regardless of whether Ezekiel 8:1 says that he sat, I had a debate with someone who said, oh, well, it says that he sat up and he's sitting or dwelling or pooping. Oops, sorry, I didn't Did I put that in there? Oh boy, that's probably not a good word, right? How about fecal matter? Whatever he was doing, it's irrelevant. It's basically what is happening. 8 verse 1 is talking about after lying on his sides for 390 days, and then 400 days he lies on the right side. And then he starts having other visions, as you'll see. If you read through that for yourself, you'll see in chapter 8 he starts moving on to other visions. And so we'll take a quick look. I'll spend some time with this because it's important. But such are important facts. Everything I'm putting on this slide page is important facts to keep in mind as we go through this 437 days. They do not overlap or progress beyond this Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 1. So here we go. Ezekiel's what I call explicit proof. It's not ambiguous. It's that there is a 13th month when we really examine this carefully, look at the wording. Whether we're looking at it in the original Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew, the translations do a pretty good job. That the time duration between Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1, through chapter 8, verse 1, we see a time of visions and happenings. Again, as I stated earlier. Notice this, beginning in 1 verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass in the 13th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives of the river Chadar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of Elohim." That's the Hebrew word there, is Elohim. Verse 2, he's kind of repeating himself on the timing of this. On the 5th day of the month, of course the 4th month, as he stated in verse 1. That's why I color-coded it there for you. Which was the 5th year. I highlighted that in green because that's important. It's the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's captivity. In verse 3, he says, the word of Yud-He-Vav-He, there's the holy name there, not just Elohim, but he's saying Yahweh, Yahuwah, the whole Yah, came expressingly. Now, this isn't where Federal Express came from or FedEx. They didn't exist back then. This is coming from our Father, his advanced technology of revealing to Ezekiel expressingly through the visions. And you can continue on with that. I don't want to cover too much information, but just what's necessary. Now let's jump to chapter 8, verse 1. And it came to pass in the 6th year. So he's describing all these visions and all these things happening, and cutting his beard and splitting it up in this way, laying on his side and laying on that side, and doing this and doing that. There's a clay tablet he's got to deal with. And so there's a lot of things he had to do, including probably eat and go to the bathroom. And so I wouldn't say that he just laid on his side 24/7 and never got up from his side. But anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent here. It says that we're talking about the 6th year in the 6th month on the 5th day of the month as I sat. And people who go by just say there's never a 13th month in here, they'll just hone in on that Hebrew word and think that disproves the 13th month, which it doesn't, as I pointed in my previous slide. And as we progress through this, you'll see it even more. He says, I sat in my house with the elders of Judah, Yehudah, sitting before me, that the hand of Adonai Yah, the holy name there. So it is used, the Hebrew word for Lord is Adonai, and it also has the holy name there, that the hand of the Most High, our Creator, fell upon me there. So here's this, like I said, this journal that he's creating here. And then Ezekiel 1:1 onward, you will see other visions after lying on his side. So that verse 1 actually proves that he wasn't lying on his side. He was sitting or sat, or he was dwelling. Some people say, oh, he was just dwelling. So that could mean that he was laying down and dwelling. And there's a lot of debate over, homonym words that we find in scriptures that they're a little bit more ambiguous than people like to propose with dogma. But here we see that the visions that are coming afterwards are post 390 days, post 40 days. And I'll let you read those for yourself on your own free time. But with the right conclusion, we can see that there's 437 plus days that occurred before this chapter 8. And this is what I'm going to get into now, going forward. So let's simplify this 12 versus 13 months during the 5th year of the king's reign here. Time duration, again, for review, between Ezekiel 1 and chapter 8, regardless of the diverse calendar systems. It doesn't matter what calendar system you go by, including all these ones that are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The 4th month, and I did not highlight the day of the month because it's not so critical, even though it's the same day as you go to the next year of the month. But the 4th month, day 5, in the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's exile until the 6th, month 6, day 5, in the 6th year of his exile. And so people want to say, oh, 12 or 13, there's 14 there. Well, it looks like 14 when you're going from month 4 to month 6 of the next year. Okay, so people say, well, that's 14. That's not 13. I mean, it's not 12. And I've had people try to correct me, and they don't seem to understand that I understand a minimum of 14. So year 1, there's 1 year and 2 months can equal either 14 or 15 months, depending on whether the 5th year of the king's exile had 12 or 13 months. So this is necessary. Elementary math and logic. It's very logical. It's very elementary math. Ezekiel 3 verse 5, you can read that for yourself. It accounts for 7 days where he's sitting and dwelling. Notice he's not lying down during those 7 days. You can read that in its context. And maybe I'll insert that with the video editing. Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 4 through 6 accounts for the 390 days and the 40 days where he's laying on his left side for Israel regarding a prophecy, and then lying on his right side for 40 days. This is a day for a year principle. This is one of the explicit areas in the Bible where a day represents a full year, not 1,000 years, but a full year. Sometimes a day is representing 1,000 years, so we can't have a cookie-cutter approach to metaphoric interpretations of a day or a year in prophecy. Nevertheless, we look at this 7 days plus the 390 plus 40. That's where we get the 437 days total. But some will say, but 437 days is not exactly 12 months and it's not exactly 13 months. Gotcha, Russell. Because 437 can't be divided by lunar cycles or any calendar cycles. Now, that's a good point, but, well, there could have been other days not listed within Ezekiel's journal of visions and events. So I don't propose that Ezekiel was listing every day. He was simply listing 7 days here, 390 days there. He's describing this event like telling a story in a chronological order, so there has to be a minimum of 437 days from between these two chapters. I mean, not two chapters, but Ezekiel 1 through Ezekiel 8. So I want to deal with the never a 13th month mindset when they read through this and they look at what we just went through in more detail. A reminder, they divide every year into 12 equal months, from either equinox to equinox, or like with the Jubilee, it'll go 364 days, and then they'll do something with the extra other days and have ways to explain that. But let's progress forward. To overestimate the math here, the elementary math, with the usage of a solar leap year day, where you have to add that extra day. A solar year is 365.25 days, but if we just say, for the sake of overestimating, 366 days. 366 divided by 12 months, is 30.5 days per month, if you were to do the math on that. So 14 months times 30.5 days equals 427 days. 427 days is 10 days short. It's 10 days less than 437 plus. Very simple math there. This is why I say that Ezekiel wasn't trying to list every single day during these visions. You know, he's dealing with clay tablets and his beard, and probably on other days that he didn't count and put numerical values to, like people would if they're doing a diary, a daily diary. Nevertheless, let's seek closer to this 437 days regarding Ezekiel. And that's the chapters there. Chapter 1, chapter 3, verse 15, chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. 14 months times 30.5 days, like we pointed out in the previous slide, is 427 days. This falls short of the 437. Now 15 months times 30.5, that's 457.5 days. Now this is possible. Like I said, Ezekiel's, it's got to be at least 437 more days. It doesn't, you know, we could argue till the cows come home how many more days, but this is a possibility. But we got to remember, the 12-month only believers do not believe in 13th months. So if they did believe in a 13th month, then this would be an ambiguous argument going through Ezekiel as counting a 13th month. But because they don't believe it, well, it kind of messes up their mathematical interpretation and understanding and logic in these chapters. So 14 months times 29.5 days, and that's roughly the lunar cycles, rounding off to 29.5. That comes out to be 413 days. Now that's still much less than 437, so it could not be 14 lunar cycles, months. But 15 times 29.5 lunar cycles becomes 442.5 days. This is the closest possibility to matching the 437 plus days. And as a side note here, lunar cycles during ancient times depended upon the visible crescent moons. So it's different than our modern Orthodox, Jewish calendar, of course. So when I say 442.5, that's just simply a mathematical equation. But if you're going by visible crescents, it would be a little more or less than that. To be able to do it accurately over a long period of time, you'd need the visible crescents of the moon to round it off to the accurate number of days for 13 months. So let's summarize Ezekiel's elementary math to break this down and simplify it. We have, again, month 4, day 5, in the 5th year of the king's exile. We have month 6. Notice how I highlight this, because I want to draw our attention to it, because it gets kind of confusing when you don't make it easy to make these connections. In the 6th year of his exile, so that's where we get the 2 months plus a year. It cannot be 14 months for any calendar system. The 5th year of king's exile had to be more than 12 months for his 5th year only. An explicit mathematical fact that our Creator has put in the Scriptures. He's hidden. He's embedded it well so that those who are truly truth seekers and have no prejudices and no agendas can find the truth if they're open to it, and if they can admit they're wrong when they're wrong, and if they've been teaching wrong, especially in influencing others. Sometimes it's hard to have the humility and to admit that to everybody. We all like to think that the Holy Spirit's giving us all our doctrines and teachings and not errors in any of them. So the closest here to 13 times lunar cycles. This is another mathematical fact. Now, regardless of Ezekiel's 13th month, the true biblical calendar for Moedim, this is for feast, must, and I'm going to go down a list. If you want to help filter out and weed out the counterfeit calendars out there, over 90% of them, here's a checklist that helps do that. It has to match the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as we also say, the Torah calendar, from biblical Hebrew possible interpretations. It's got to match that, right? Lights in the firmament. An invisible moon is not light in the firmament. So that doesn't fit the equation to go by a dark moon. You know, the adversary likes to start his years in the darkest and coldest time of the year, right? Close to that winter solstice. The Romans like to start their days in the darkest time of the night, midnight. And so darkness does not fit the equation of lights in the firmament. And if we use darkness or darker time periods than our Creator has already ordained and established, then, well, it's not going to fit the possible interpretations. Also, must match the Tanakh, as also known as the Old Testament, its usage of the 7 times Babylonian month names. Now, there's 12 month names, and then there's Adar 2, which is the 13th when that comes around. But ever since 499 BCE, the archaeology, all of it is unanimously showing that these 7 Babylonian month names, that the Tanakh, the way the Jews were doing it back then, Judah, ever since the Second Temple was built, we see the Second Temple leadership. It's got to match that, the religious Jewish eyewitness history. So there's eyewitnesses of the Second Temple period like Josephus and Philo, which are also, they're still misunderstood by a lot of people who read their writings, as a lot of people misunderstand Paul's writings. And when highly intelligent people are hard to understand in their writings especially, and they need, you say, oh, what do you mean by this? Can you explain that for me a little bit better? It sounded like you're believing this and that. Well, if they don't have enough disclaimers and simple language, it's hard to understand. And plus Josephus and Philo writing in other languages than our own native tongue, I've noticed that they've been misunderstood as well. But I have writings on that to help explain them. Like Philo, he kept Shabbat. He went to the synagogue every Sabbath. He learned from his rabbis. And so what he represents is what he was taught by the rabbinical leaders of his day in Alexandria, and what they learned from Jerusalem. And he encouraged Jews to go to Jerusalem to keep the feast. He kept them there in Alexandria. He wasn't just some secular Hellenized Jew. In fact, he even complained in some of his writings about Jews who were not keeping Torah in Alexandria, complaining about Hellenization. And Josephus wanting to save his life and not wanting to be an extremist and fight and just, follow that whole oral law to the extreme. He's more moderate, but these are historians, and I'm not saying that they were doctrinally right on everything. That's not what I'm trying to propose. But they are eyewitnesses to the way the calendar was practiced unanimously by the Second Temple leadership. Philo never addresses the counting of the Omer, which shows that he he tried to avoid the debates and arguments of the rabbis. He just presented what was being practiced in Jerusalem and how it was done and how a month began and a little bit about a year and so forth. So that history is important to consider, which I can provide for anyone out there. And also Herb Selinsky, who's been studying this since 1967, grew up in a Jewish home and had access to the yeshiva schools and has traveled through multiple libraries, yeshiva and universities and public libraries, to track down as much information as he could from Philo, Josephus, and other writings, not just them, but also the Talmud and access to the Talmud and everything. Great writings. If anyone wants his information, I can give that to you. You can go to biblicalcalendar.org, or I'll post that link to his website when I edit this video. Nevertheless, next point here, there's 2,000 years of the most credible, when I say lighter-skinned Jewish history. You know, and I'm not saying that we follow what they admit to changing, but what convinced me to follow the views that I view is I studied what they admitted to changing in the way they recorded how it was done, and I thought, wow, if it matches Scripture and they admit to changing it, very similarly as the Catholics admit to changing the weekly Sabbath, and they admit to why, and that they had the authority to do so, and this is the way it was before. Some of the best information on the changing of the Sabbath comes from the Catholics themselves, and so what I propose, Jewish history admits to a lot with some good research. But a lot of people I've come across who still debate that with me, they still have this axe to grind against the Jews, the Pharisees, whether it be a racial thing or because in the churches they were taught that they're smarter than the Jews, better than the Jews are way down here. This is the baggage we got to overcome as we come into this movement, is to just really look at the truth and want to follow the way the calendar was done. And because if we believe in the New Testament, the major events all happened according to the Second Temple leadership and the descendants, how they recorded their understanding of it. And not that they were perfect, but when it's unanimous with Scripture, these are all my points. This is the checklist here that will help really weed out the counterfeit calendars, the wrong calendars that are not accurately ordained since the time of Moses, the writing of the written Torah. And people want to debate about what was before the flood. That's debatable and ambiguous. And stuff has been added to the books of Enoch and taken out. We don't know all what. That's why it wasn't canonized. And that's why I say lighter-skinned Jews, they've canonized the Tanakh. And so I come into debates with people, say they want to question the canonization, and all the Catholics canonize the New Testament. We can't trust anything anymore. What it comes down to is you just can't trust your Holy Bible anymore when you progress to that level. And I've come across a lot of prejudice from different angles on trying to help people with this filtering process to weed out the counterfeit calendars. Now, I mentioned the 7 Babylonian month names. I wanted to list that here for you, even though I've provided other teachings that a lot of people who are coming into this video teaching probably aren't aware of. So it's a very important question to ask. Why are there 7 Babylonian month names within the inspired Tanakh? With absolute religious freedom, with especially, Nehemiah and Ezra. Ezra, the high priest of the Second Temple building, and Nehemiah. Nehemiah says in chapter 13, verse 30, he says, I cleanse them of everything pagan. And here he's saying Nisan. He's not saying Aviv. It's important to know why they did these things and to question it, to help us draw the proper conclusions. So, Babylonian calendar parallelism, not phobia. If we can overcome this phobia, we can see that there's a parallelism since 499 BCE, that every month as can still be proven with the clay tablets that have been preserved, that every month began with the first visible waxing crescent moon shortly after sunset on the western horizon. Every year began with the first visible waxing crescent moon either on or after the vernal equinox. Never any specific stage of barley alone. So I capitalize all caps alone. Barley was an indicator. If there wasn't barley, they couldn't do the wave sheaf. They would postpone it enough, and they would, if there wasn't enough lambs, Gamaliel, his son, Shimon, wrote that. And there's a letter writing on that that's still available, and that I can provide, and Herb Solinsky can provide, that yeah, well, if there wasn't enough lambs, not enough doves, there's other evidence I've seen, if the roads were too muddy, sometimes they would postpone the spring feast a month, but not every year based upon the barley alone, as many people out there are doing, as just a percentage of the Karaites and Nehemiah Gordon and some others are proposing as the only indicator to begin a year with the first new moon after a certain stage of barley. Nevertheless, when it comes to the Babylonian calendar, either Judah, the nation of Judah, we call the Jewish people, they either adopted and learned from the Babylonians after 499 BCE, this pagan calendar, as many people claim, or the second possibility is that the Babylonians learned and eventually began copying the faithful Jews who had witnessed to them. For example, Daniel. Daniel was before 499 BCE, and he survived 4 kings, a Babylonian king and some Persian kings, and so what I see is a more likely possibility for the inspired word, Tanakh, to have 7 Babylonian month names out of the 12, the 7 being an interesting number as a key clue for those searching for perfection, to see that the Babylonian, Daniel planted some seeds, and his 3 friends and other smart, Jewish people who were under the Babylonian exile as slaves and eunuchs, they planted some seeds. And by 499 BCE, we see the Babylonians starting their years and their months. Generally speaking, we could see that as the Jewish people were, and that's why the Jewish people would use their Babylonian month names. Like many of us say Saturday when we're dealing with the secular world, and their whole world is familiar with the word Saturday, to be explicit on what day that we rest from. It's not wrong and a sin to always use these names, and I wouldn't go the sacred name extremist route and saying you never say these names because they go back to some kind of pagan deity. Well, we see faithful Jews, like I said, like Nehemiah, Ezra, and others using these Babylonian month names as well in the inspired word. So someday everyone will what? Tachufah. They'll understand this Hebrew word also, as will come out later. And in the meantime, there's literature I can share with you if you request, either via email or online. You can make comments in the video teaching that I post onto YouTube here. And I will appreciate your patience, any meekness, respect, and zealous interest with an open mind to prove all things, to seek first the kingdom. And if we want to keep these biblical feasts at the appointed times more accurately, just taking baby steps and learning as we go. If you are on that path with me, that's greatly appreciated, always.